All right, forget the intro today. We're jumping into this immediately because I've got a really cool one for you this week. It's a turntable, but it's not just any turntable. Ready? This is a Technics SL-DL1 from 1981. What makes this turntable special? Well, two things. One, it looks like a DeLorean. That's reason enough. But two, and this is the key, it's what's called a linear tracking turntable. If you're not familiar with that, stick around. I'll show you exactly what that means, and I'll give you a full tour of this thing. But we need to do a little bit of history first, because that's what we do. You can't just eat candy for dinner, okay? So let's start in 1965. Matsushita Electric, who we know as Panasonic, launched the brand Technics as a high-end hi-fi brand because they wanted to go after some of the heavy hitters like Nakamichi. They started off with fancy speakers, but what they did that was special was to create the first direct drive turntables. Initially, turntables were driven by a belt. There's a little motor here and a platter there and a belt that couples them. Now, if you're like me and you've had to change an old belt on a record or tape player, you know that it can be really messy. I don't know what the hell they made those belts out of, but it turns into black goo after a couple of decades and it gets all over everything. It is disgusting. The direct drive turntable eliminated the belt by popping a platter right on top of the specifically designed motor spindle. The inventor was an engineer at Matsushita Electric named Suichi Obata. Without a belt, the turntables were more stable, had a quicker spin-up time, and though they didn't know it at the time, didn't end up full of sticky belt crap 30 years later, which was the best part. Now, the other type of turntable drive uses an idler wheel, which is basically a tiny plastic wheel with a tiny rubber tire on it that contacts a surface on the platter to spin it. The problem with those is, just like the belts, they rot after a while. But unlike belts, they seem to be a lot harder to source replacements for, at least at any kind of reasonable price. You usually have to get the whole part from another dead unit, whereas belts are just fancy rubber bands you can buy in bulk packs for a couple bucks on Amazon or eBay. What's significant here is that direct drive turntables gave rise to DJs, not the fast-talking car salesman who announced songs for KRAP. I mean the EDM festival thing. Direct drive turntables didn't get damaged by spinning the platter back and forth. The records themselves, obviously that's a different story. But it was a big deal, and it opened the door for early hip-hop artists like DJ Kool Herc, Grandmaster Flash, to develop the style in the late 70s and early 80s. So, short version. Technics started in 1965. It was meant to be a premium brand for Panasonic. It launched the first direct drive turntable, hip-hop. Can I move on? Awesome. Let's go play with the turntable. I want to start by just showing you how great this unit looks as a whole. It's very thin and sleek, and the top cover angles downward slightly, so it's got that sweet 80s spaceship look going. A nice black accent on the back of the very lightly smoked plastic dust cover, then silver everywhere else. The inside is clean. No buttons, no controls, no anything, just the spinning platter. And the buttons on the front are all square with a black bezel. Very handsomely designed machine. As I said, this is the Technics SL-DL1. It's a linear tracking turntable. What that means is rather than having a large tone arm fixed to the plinth, you actually have a little one hooked directly onto the lid, which is moved slowly back and forth by a motor in sync with the spiral groove of the record. It's a little more complicated than that, which we will come back to, but for now that's basically the difference. It's controlled by a microcomputer, which can have any number of functions programmed into it, like queuing, skipping, pausing, or whatever you want. On the front, you have the controls. You have the power button, the speed selectors, and the pitch adjustment on the left side, and then the start and stop controls, the queuing button, and the repeat function. All you do is open the lid, put the record on the platter, and press play. It does the rest. If you notice, the start and stop buttons have two little triangle lights above them. That's because these also function as the track skipping or replay function. Press and hold, and the little tone arm picks the stylus up, moves it forward or backward to where you want it, then you just hit the cue button, and boom, next song. Except usually you miss and get a few seconds of the last song because it's really hard to see exactly where the little shiny bit is. Because this unit isn't quartz locked, it has a pitch adjustment. To use it, you get the record going, then you look down into this little red mind control device, prism. Inside are a bunch of little moving dots that are machined onto the bottom of the platter, which correspond to the timing of the red strobe light. To adjust it, you turn the dial forward or back until one row of dots stops moving. There's 2 speeds and 4 rows of dots. Anybody want to guess why there are 4 rows instead of 2? Stick around to the end and I'll explain that. All right, now some of you are probably asking, how does it deal with 7 inches? Or 10s? That's actually where things get really interesting. Under the platter are 3 red LED lights. They correspond to the 3 little holes on the platter and the rubber slip mat, which are each positioned just shy of where a 12, 10, or 7-inch record would sit. When the record is placed on the platter, 10-inch in this case, it covers 1, 2, or 3 lights. By placing a little light sensor on the lid, the computer automatically knows the size of the record and drops the stylus accordingly. Of course, that begs two questions. Number one, what happens when you're dealing with transparent vinyl? And two, why are there 3 lights if one is always covered? The answer to the first question is remarkably clever and very inexpensive. There's a little switch in the lid that allows you to override the lights and select the size yourself. The reason I find it clever is it's actually not a switch at all. Inside is just a little piece of plastic that covers the different light sensors and tricks the computer into thinking that there's a record on the platter. But here's the really clever bit. The third light isn't a size detector. That's a safety mechanism that tells the computer if there's a record at all. So if that light detector sees a signal, it won't start the platter spinning or drop the tone arm. Now I did have a little trouble with this when I first got it. It needed some grease and the tiny belt that moved the tone arm was loose. It wasn't able to move the tone arm every time, so it would occasionally make the record skip. But that brings me to another cool aspect of this machine. Check this out. When the record is playing, the tone arm isn't being driven all the time. It pivots a few degrees in the housing. Inside the mechanism is a little switch, and as the stylus tracks across the record, it eventually triggers the switch and the computer jogs the whole mechanism over a few millimeters. It's pretty simple. It actually just moves it until the switch isn't pressed anymore. I kind of freaked out a little bit when I had the top pulled apart. At one point, I was testing it and the whole thing just stopped working. I couldn't get anything to move. I thought I had totally scrapped it. But actually, as it turned out, the work light that I was using, which was really low and super bright, was actually shining directly into the light sensors and the computer registered it as an empty platter. I just turned off the light, worked fine again. But it freaked me out. You're still able to adjust the tracking force as well. There's a little screw in the back with a counterweight, and you can make slight adjustments to that. And lastly, for transport or storage, the tone arm locks in place with this little tab that rotates. So, now the million-dollar question. How does it sound? Well, unfortunately, unlike the reel-to-reel machine I covered previously, I can't really demo this thing for you. The big stumbling block here is copyright. While I do have several odd punk band records that probably wouldn't get flagged, they're also pretty much garage recordings, so that doesn't really do us a whole lot of good here. You're going to have to take my word on this, but I think it sounds really good, considering the stylus is as old as the turntable itself and is not a fancy upgrade. Now, I didn't have time to do a side-by-side comparison with this and my other record player. I just tried a few different styles of music using the best recordings I could dig out of my own collection. This time I used my own stereo setup because I'm familiar with how everything usually sounds. To me, this unit has a really bright sound, emphasis on mids and highs, and really clear. It seemed to sound best with electronic music, but it really sounds good with other stuff too. I know if I didn't already have the turntable I'm using, I would be stoked to have this thing as my main setup. To answer the question about the 2 rows of dots, that's because different parts of the world use different AC frequencies, 50 in some regions, 60 in others. The strobe speed is determined by the mains frequency, and it's cheaper and easier to just put all the dots on the same platter and use it for both instead of manufacturing 2 different incompatible parts. But otherwise, that's it. I hope you liked that. If you did, please hit that subscribe button for more weird hi-fi history as brought to you by my local thrift stores, and I'll see you guys next time. Stay metal.